Flying remains the safest form of transport, but recent incidents of extreme turbulence have once again put air travel in the spotlight. So, what's going on and why is turbulence likely to get even worse? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. So, picture this. You're on a flight at cruising altitude, you've unbuckled your seatbelt and you're absorbed in a movie. The seatbelt sign comes on, there's a good chance you ignore it. But as air turbulence increases, both in force and frequency, that little belt could prevent some serious injuries.
Signs of distress and destruction. A Singapore Airlines flight with such severe turbulence, one British man died and dozens of people ended up in intensive care.
I'm lucky. A lot of people have got some spinal issues from hitting their head and then kind of connecting back down. So they've had quite a few scans. I've heard a lot of people can barely move their back. I'm very fortunate to be able to walk and come out here only really 24 hours later. Yeah.
The aircraft dropped 6,000 feet in under 5 minutes. Signs so far are pointing to clear air turbulence, which is not caused by storms or clouds. This kind of disturbance, as the name suggests, doesn't appear on radar and is invisible to the human eye. Instances of clear air turbulence are rising. Scientists believe climate change is to blame. Warmer, slower jet streams interact with colder, faster ones, causing air friction and turbulence. The warmer the air, the greater the difference in temperature, the more severe the turbulence. While the planes themselves can handle the pressure, turbulence is putting airlines under stress. Some estimate the cost at over $1 billion a year in repairs, compensation, and extra fuel. But for those who already feel nervous about flying, the possibility of a bumpier ride may be enough to ditch plans for a far-off destination, and that could mean turbulent times for airlines in the years to come.
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Florida in the United States is Captain Shem Malmquist. He flies Boeing 777s and is an instructor at the Florida Institute of Technology, College of Aeronautics. He's also a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Paul Williams is a professor of atmospheric science. That's at the University of Reading in England. And in Dublin is Marina Efthymiou. She's professor of aviation management at the Dublin City University Business School. And here with me in the studio, Simon Calder, one of the UK's best-known travel journalists. Shem, I'll come to you first of all. Just tell us what it's like flying through turbulence, what it feels like, and how well-trained you guys and girls are for it.
Well, I would say it's very much like driving over a rough road, particularly, I think, more analogous to a motorcycle or maybe really rough water in a boat. We just try to ride it. You don't fight it too much. Essentially, you try to keep the wings level and the aircraft pitch attitude within reasonable limits. It's not something that is a huge concern, generally more of a nuisance from up front, but of course, if it's severe, it can offer other problems, particularly for passengers and cabin crew.
It's been a huge talking point, Shem, recently, hasn't it? I mean, everything that has happened, particularly the Singapore Airlines incident, how shocked were you?
Well, really not too surprised. And, we're seeing, I have just noticed an increase in turbulence and also severe weather around the world over the last, it's been increasing throughout my career, which is spanning nearly 40 years. But recently, it seems like it's accelerating. So we're seeing a lot of areas of turbulence that we really did not experience in the same frequency as we used to have. I'm a big fan of Professor Williams, the other guest here, and I think he's really outlined some of the factors there. But it is certainly something that is a concern for us in terms of aircraft, flying safety, passenger safety, and just general operations.
That's a very good point, Paul, isn't it? That climate change campaigners will point out that this is quite ironic what we are seeing, given everything they've been telling us for decades about climate change.
Yes, poetic justice, if you like, because, of course, aviation makes a contribution to climate change. Currently, it's a small contribution, just a few percent, but the difficulty is that the other sectors of the economy are going to decarbonize rapidly now, and aviation is going to find that difficult. Just keeping such a large object in the skies when gravity is trying to pull it down to Earth requires an enormous amount of energy. And really, the only practical way to generate that volume of energy today is by burning fossil fuels. And of course, people are working very hard to come up with alternatives. And we really need those people to get results as soon as possible.
Marina, just looking at some stats from Paul's University, severe turbulence is up 55% since 1979. Should we be worried about this now?
Yeah, I will fully agree. We need to be more and more worried about, especially clear air turbulence, because also as traffic is increasing and aviation contributing more and more to climate change, we're going to see this being more frequent. And I would like also to echo what my colleagues mentioned, that we need to be more efficient on decarbonizing our transport, and we need to move a little bit faster on that. And also materialize the net zero emissions by 2050.
Simon, I want to talk about passenger behaviour, because we get on planes and people are now so accustomed to flying that instantly they're having drinks, they're watching films, the seatbelt is off, and they're not paying attention to the cabin crew a lot of the time. There's got to be some emphasis on passenger behaviour.
There certainly has, and it's really notable to see how much since the tragedy last month on a flight from London Heathrow to Singapore, in which a passenger died after suffering a heart attack, how much that has actually changed two things. First of all, in the context of Singapore Airlines, they are now being much stricter. They are effectively saying wear your seatbelt at all times, which actually, for those of us who've been in cars for the last half century, actually makes a lot of sense anyway. Why would you not keep your belt fastened? I think so many people got used to the idea that flying is safe, and we had last year, incredibly, the first year in which no passengers died on passenger scheduled jets. Extraordinary. And now it looks as though you're actually much more at risk of turbulence being thrown around the cabin than you are of being involved in an accident. So a really interesting time, and one which I hope everyone watching this will just think, OK, yeah, of course I'll keep my seatbelt fastened, except when I'm using the washroom or I'm stretching my legs. Of course, difficult for cabin crews to do that. They're at work. And it was very alarming to see the serious injuries suffered by a number of Singapore Airlines cabin crew.
There was a big air conference recently in Dubai, IATA, all the CEOs getting together. Do you think we're nearing a stage now where they'll come out and say, you're on a plane, you stay strapped in the whole flight?
Yes, I mean, it really is a very, very negligible cost for the passenger enjoyment, and it makes perfect sense. And of course, they will also be legally at some peril if they do not say, OK, everybody, you've got to keep your seatbelt fastened. That is an order from the captain, from the commander of this aircraft, which you must obey. And if that were to happen, then yes, I can see, even though turbulence is increasing, severe turbulence increasing particularly, this will help to keep us safe, although it won't necessarily be a comfortable ride.
There have been a lot of injuries over the years attributed to turbulence. So between 2009 and 2021, 146 passengers and crew were seriously hurt due to turbulence. That's according to the US Federal Aviation Administration. In December 2022, 20 people were hospitalized after turbulence on a Hawaiian Airlines flight from Phoenix to Honolulu. In August of 2023, 11 people were taken to a hospital after severe turbulence on a US Delta flight before landing in Atlanta. And in May of this year, as we've discussed, one passenger tragically died on a flight due to turbulence. That was from London Heathrow to Singapore. Shem, what's the feeling like in the pilot community? Do you think passengers need to start listening more and that things are going to be tightened up with regard to the seatbelt?
Oh, absolutely. I can't imagine sitting down on an aircraft and not having my belt on. It is just the same feeling, I guess, in driving an automobile these days, without a seatbelt. It just feels wrong, and there is considerable risk. It does not have to be cinched down so you're tight, although I would recommend that for takeoff or landing, or if you know there's turbulence, but at least tight enough so you're not flying around able to hit the ceiling of the aircraft, because these things are getting difficult and challenging. And from the pilot community, some of the things that we are seeing is that as these weather events are increasing, we are still relying on some methods and techniques for avoiding turbulence that have become somewhat, I would argue, invalidated over time. And so passengers need to be aware that until these processes are updated, that we need to be more careful, and really even afterwards, because that is your final protection and to ensure that you're not injured. It's bad enough for the cabin crew who have to be up and about, but the passengers, that seatbelt is vital.
Paul, just on that point, I know it's scant consolation to the family involved, but that incident on the Singapore Airlines flight has got everyone talking about turbulence, and everyone got talking about safety belts and being safe and secure while flying. Do you think that this can actually do some good long term?
Well, it sounds like an awful thing to say, doesn't it? But I think often in a changing climate, it does take a disaster to change the way we operate. You gave some injury statistics. It's important to realize they're just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, they're just the people who were hospitalized for at least 48 hours. That's the requirement, at least in the US, for mandatory reporting by the airline to the authorities. So there will be many more injuries that were classified as minor and do not make it into the official statistics. So I do think that this Singapore encounter was dreadful. It must have felt awful being on board. I think it must have felt like being on a roller coaster without any restraints in place for those people who weren't seatbelted. And then just a few days later, there was another encounter that made headlines around the world. And I think seeing two injury-causing events just a few days apart, we would never blame climate change for one of those. What we can say, though, is that for every 3 patches of a special type of invisible turbulence called clear air turbulence in the Atlantic today, one of those is there because of climate change, but we can't say which one. So we'll never be able to say that your particular turbulent flight was caused by climate change. But what we can say is that climate change is putting more turbulence in the atmosphere. And so this is the sort of thing that we can expect more of in future unless countermeasures are taken. And indeed, there are things we can do to help.
Marina, what is clear air turbulence? Can it be spotted on radar, or do pilots just suddenly find themselves trapped inside it?
Yeah, clear air turbulence, it's becoming more and more difficult to predict and therefore avoid. So we do see pilots facing more and more clear air turbulence, primarily because of climate change. So while we have seen the aircraft becoming more structurally the structural integrity of the aircraft is becoming better, we see those incidents more and more, like also with Dublin and Qatar incident lately. So maybe some of the ways we could avoid the clear air turbulences, apart from the awareness for the passengers to always keep their seatbelts on, is also contribute towards climate change mitigation and adaptation. So better prediction systems, more training for the pilots, and changing the flight paths to some extent, and mitigating climate change, investing in sustainable aviation fuels, airspace architecture optimization, and also better technology.
Simon, none of this will be helping nervous flyers, will it?
Exactly right. And that is the really worrying aspect of this, because people will have seen the terrible images of that Singapore Airlines flight. Indeed, we had the reference there to a Qatar Airways flight from Doha to Dublin, in which there was also severe turbulence. And they may conclude completely wrongly, I'm not getting on an aircraft, I'll be hurled around, it will be scary and I could get injured. So they might decide, for example, to drive across Europe or the US instead, which is magnifying their risk just immensely. I mean, aviation now very, very safe indeed. Roads, unfortunately, well, while no passengers were being killed last year in passenger jet accidents, very sadly, 1.25 million people died on the roads. And whenever there's an incident, people will, after 9/11, many people said, I'm never flying again. I'm just going to stick to the car. I'm safer. You're not, but it is a natural human reaction. It's very worrying for the airlines. And of course, it would be doubly tragic if people were to move from air to road and then get harmed.
Well, let's take a look at the most turbulent air journeys around the world. According to the turbulence forecast tool Turbulence, Santiago in Chile to Santa Cruz in Bolivia is the most turbulent route. Second is Almaty in Kazakhstan to Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. Third is in China from Lanzhou to Chengdu. And the fourth is in Japan from Tokonome to Sendai. And the fifth is actually in Europe, Milan to Geneva, the most turbulent route in Europe. Shem, give us a few stories from your aviation career, 40 years flying. What was the scariest incident, really, that had you kind of clinging on in the cockpit?
Well, we've had a few cases of running into thunderstorms that were not detected on the weather radar using some of the techniques and methods or even the automated radars that we have now, where it's just not showing up on the radar. And part of that is because the models that we are using are based on the way thunderstorms manifest in North America. And so we're seeing these storms over warm ocean waters. Of course, the ocean water areas that are warm, it's expanding as the water heats up. And these storms just manifest differently. And so that can be a very unexpected and exciting ride, would be an understatement. Although I'd have to say the worst turbulence I ever had was spanning back now to, I suppose, around 1984, where I was flying a smaller airline on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountain range and encountered turbulence that could only be classified as extreme. But after some experience, you do learn how to avoid certain areas based on looking at the terrain, the topography, and planning around that. And it's a bit easier than avoiding a thunderstorm that does not show up on the weather radar using traditional techniques when we are already flying in the clouds where you cannot see anything.
Paul, I want to talk about how safe and secure the pilot community are, because these guys and girls, in addition to flying tens of thousands of hours with real passengers, in between, they've got to keep up something called recency in the flight simulator. So they're extremely well trained for it, aren't they?
They're very well trained, and I would never hesitate to board any commercial aircraft in the world, and I would be secure in the knowledge that there was an expert at the front of the aircraft keeping all the passengers as safe as possible. It is important to keep that perspective, I think, especially after these headlines around the world about injuries and sadly a fatality. The serious injury rate on a commercial flight is 1 serious injury per 1 million flight departures. So just think about that. You'd have to take 1 million flights, and even then, it's only one passenger on one of those flights that would be injured, not necessarily you. So I would like to emphasize the safety of flying. Severe turbulence that has the potential to cause injuries is rare. Something like less than 1/10 of 1% of the atmosphere has turbulence in it that's strong enough to lift you up out of your seat if you're not seatbelted. And even if that doubles or trebles, which is a worst case scenario according to the future projections, it would still be a tiny fraction of the air that has that turbulence in it. The chances of your particular flight encountering it are very, very small. But of course, given the number of aircraft in the skies at any time, sooner or later, one of those aircraft will unfortunately hit that turbulence. And so we will, of course, continue to see injuries unless we get very good at avoiding turbulence in future.
Marina, those safety statistics Paul just mentioned are truly incredible. I mean, aviation, for all the negative headlines recently about a couple of extremely isolated incidents, it does remain a very, very safe form of transport.
For sure, maybe it's the safest means of transport. It's safer taking a plane than driving to your local supermarket. We have seen significant innovations in the aircraft technology, with the materials being stronger and stronger. So even if you do encounter a clear air turbulence, which doesn't have any visual indicators like clouds and storms, the aircraft can still sustain that. And just to echo again once more that keeping the seatbelts on can avoid small injuries on the plane. So despite all of those and the latest events, air transport is the safest means of transportation, despite all of that. So I will continue to fly for sure.
Simon, what does it mean in terms of travel insurance and also compensation? Because the people on that Singapore flight are being offered financial compensation now.
That's a really good question. So what's immediately happened was that Singapore Airlines came out and said, if you were mildly injured, minor injuries from that terrible event, we will give you $10,000. And they're clearly wanting to kind of get ahead of the possible legal claims that could come in. And that is going to be interesting because you can be, I think, quite sure that lawyers will be looking at whether they think they can extract more, particularly for the very seriously injured passengers and cabin crew. And a lot of that is going to depend on whether they can demonstrate that there was a visible threat. Now, Singapore Airlines came out very swiftly after the event last month and said this was clear air turbulence. I have heard from people in the pilot community that they think that maybe there was actually a convective storm. Well, there will be a fall, and that's a great thing about aviation safety. Every single incident is investigated to see what we can learn from it. But there's actually some geopolitical things at work here as well, because one reason perhaps we're getting more incidents of onboard turbulence, besides the climate change aspect, is the fact that since Russian airspace is closed to most of the world's airlines now, between East Asia and Europe, instead of flying over Siberia for many hours, which you would normally do, the airlines are forced to fly over the Balkans in southern Europe, over Turkey, then through the Caucasus and over Central Asia. In particular, this flight was just over the Bay of Bengal. And that could happen more if you are flying in more southerly latitudes, which is where, towards the tropics, you tend to get more turbulence.
Shem, back to you. Simon just mentioned that the learning that is shared in aviation, anytime there is a problem or a major incident, that's true, isn't it? Airlines, pilots, you guys are constantly learning and sharing what has happened, and the end result is a safer flight the next time.
Oh, absolutely true. In addition to flying, I've been involved with quite a few major accident investigations, and they're extremely thorough. But we also, of course, investigate any incident, and there are many reports that are more internal that are investigated that never reach the public. And all of those are shared through various mechanisms, not only within a single airline, but also with the larger airline community. And so we're seeing these types of events. And as we go forward, hopefully the training will, improve and match it. But, one of the areas, for example, the Bay of Bengal is notorious for these types of thunderstorms that do not show reflectivity. And so I'm really hopeful that people will learn from this, that are methods of identifying convective weather over areas such as that, the Bay of Bengal area, which is actually particularly notorious for this. We improve the training, and so each of these events we do learn from. But what we really also need to do is use more proactive methods to identify problems before they happen. And there is some work coming, essentially using system theory that is showing very promising results towards that end. That is being implemented more and more in the aviation industry.
Sound advice. Thank you, Paul, Marina, Shem, and Simon Calder here in the studio with me. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.